Hello, in this video we will talk about how to flatten parent-child hierarchy. Since you found this video, I assume you have some familiarity with what a parent-child hierarchy is. However, there are several intricacies and quirks that you need to be aware of for the parent-child hierarchy to work well in Power BI. And when I mean work well in Power BI, I say that with a caveat. Parent-child hierarchies do not natively work with Power BI. Some techniques are necessary to adopt a parent-child hierarchy for Power BI, so in this video we will take a look at some of these techniques. So let's take a look at the parent-child hierarchy and the way it should be set up to work in Power BI. So as you can see, I have a very simple HR data set where in employee 1 we have John, who's the CEO, and we only have 4 columns in this file: employee ID, which uniquely identifies the employee, employee name, employee's title. And then here we have manager employee ID. That's what having these 2 columns, employee and manager employee ID, is what defines it as a parent-child hierarchy, where manager employee ID would be a parent and employee ID would be a child. So let's kind of go through some of these records and make sure that you guys are familiar with how it's set up. So record number 1 is John, CEO. For him, there is no manager, so we leave that cell empty. And that's very important. A lot of times people have a hard time working with parent-child hierarchies because the very top of the parent-child hierarchy does not have an empty parent. So Power BI will not work with a parent-child hierarchy where that condition is not true. So make sure that every parent-child hierarchy is set up in such a way that the top node of the hierarchy, its manager or parent ID is null, is not populated. So now that we're done with John, that's the hardest part of this parent-child hierarchy. Then we have Tom, who is the VP of HR. His ID is 2, his manager ID is 1 because he reports to John and John is 1. Then 3 is Mary, she's a VP of IT. Again, she reports to John, whose ID is 1. Jenny is VP of Sales, her ID is 4, and she also reports to John. Then we have Kathy. Kathy's ID is 5. She's an HR director and she reports in 2, and 2 is Tom. So because manager ID is 2, we can always figure out who Kathy's manager is. I just need to look him up in the employee column. It's Tom. And then let's just take a look at Paul. So Paul is an HR analyst. His ID is 7. He reports into a person with ID 5, which is Kathy, who reports into a person with ID 2, which is Tom. And Thomas reports into a person with ID 1, which is John. So here we have several levels. So we can look at Paul is at the bottom of the hierarchy, reports into Kathy. So that's going to be the next level. Kathy reports into Tom. That's another level. And then he reports into John. So we have at least 4 levels of reporting in this example. So what happens if we don't flatten this hierarchy? Well, if we, for example, take a look at travel expenses, and let's take a look at how travel expenses are captured. So travel expenses are captured very simply. We have another table, we have a date, employee ID, and travel expenses, right? So this employee and this date spend this much in travel expense. So it's a very simple file. So without having a roll-up, if I just drag my employee name in the slicer, I can take a look at all of my employees and see what the travel expenses are. But you see, by default, it doesn't show things hierarchically. However, in this example, we do have a hierarchy where we have John has these direct reports, Tom, Jenny, and Mary. Tom has direct reports of Kathy, and Kathy has 2 analysts of Linda and Paul. There's a couple of other complications with this, so let's get through the basic things first, and then I will make it more interesting at the end, how to make more sophisticated parent-child hierarchies. So how do we implement this in Power BI. So the first thing was I created a table I loaded that Excel spreadsheet into Power BI. The spreadsheet had two tabs, employee and travel expenses. So here we're looking at the employee tab, and we have employee, employee name, title, and manager employee ID, which are the original columns from the file. The first thing we're gonna do, we need to do in order to flatten this, is to use a function that's part of Power BI DAX that allows us to convert a parent-child hierarchy into a level-based hierarchy. And I will explain what that is. But before we do that, path is the, so let's create a new column here. And we will create a path. So the way this works is we're using a path function, which is the DAX function, and it has two parameters. It takes employee ID, which is the child, and then it takes the parent ID. And then let's see what this returns. So every time you work with parent-child hierarchies, you just need to remember that the first thing you need to do is this path command. And the reason we are having to deal with all this is because Power BI does not, and I repeat, does not work with parent-child hierarchies the way some other technologies do. So that's why if we were to work with a parent-child hierarchy, we have to convert it or flatten it from parent-child into a level-based hierarchy. So, and I will explain what that level-based means. So the first thing that we did was we created this path. And then you could see, once the path is created, you see what that means. For example, that helps me understand for each row in the data set, it helped me understand its relationship to the top node in the hierarchy. So we know that John is a CEO. He's going to be at the very top, and then so every employee in the company has to trace his way or her way back into John. So here we look at Paul, and then his path is 1, 2, 5, 7. So that means that at the lowest level, 7, that's Paul. And the way this path will always be that the last number, the last element in path is the current ID of the record. So here we're looking at Paul, 7, so this string will end at 7. And then pipe separated are all of the IDs that come before Paul that lead him to John. So here we have 1, 2, 5, 7, and that means that 7 is Paul, 5 is manager before him, so it's Kathy, you can see it's 5, then it's 2, that's Tom, and then 1 is John. So you see path, what path does, it takes that hierarchy, and the relationship between employee, child, and manager employee, which is a parent, and just builds a string with pipe separated of all of the IDs that come in order to trace that relationship. So in our case, we see that the longest string has 4 elements. So I would say that we will need to then create 4 levels in our hierarchy in order to represent that relationship. So what you would want to do is some hierarchies become quite deep. I've worked with hierarchies that's 20, 30, 40 elements deep. It's not common, but certainly in 10 to 15 is not uncommon, particularly if you're in finance or if you have a cost center hierarchy. So you will often see quite a few levels in those hierarchies. So in this case, we're looking at depth of 4. Another useful column to have in this particular example, so if you're coming at it from the HR perspective, is to know whether each record in this set or each employee here, whether that person does or does not have direct reports. And it'll be apparent why this is interesting a little bit later. So I'm going to do a right click, new column, and we're going to add a column that's going to be called hasDirectReports. So we're here in a table employee 2. Okay, so I took a quick shortcut and fixed that formula. So here we have a function hasDirect or column hasDirectReports, and the way that works, it says, okay, there's a contains function in DAX that's going to take a look at the table and see if that table has in a column in that table there is a certain value, if it's there or not. So in this case, we're saying, does the table all employee, so where I want to look into the whole table, not just the one record at a time, and take a look at the employee manager employee ID and see if my current ID is in that column. So if my employee ID exists anywhere in a manager employee ID, that means that there is a direct employee that has me as their manager. So it's just a convenient thing that allows me to see who is the manager, who is not, or who has direct reports and who doesn't. Okay, now we're going to start adding our levels for the hierarchy. So what we're going to do is we're going to create level 1 ID. So what we're going to do is take every path, and for each component of the path, put that ID in the column. So first one is going to be level 1 ID. And what we're going to do is we're using a function called PATHITEM. So the way PATHITEM function works, it takes the path, which is this pipe separated string, and it extracts the number, the ID, or the value that's at this in this order. So if I put 2, it would take the second value in the path. If I put 3, it would take the third. If I put 4, it would take the fourth. So I will do that for all 4 levels that we need to create. I'm not going to record all of them, just run through them and then come back to recording. Here you go. So now I have all levels created, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Formula is the same. I'm just changing, the only thing I'm changing is the index in the path for each. So what you will notice is that if my path only has 2, then I will have value for level 1, level 2, and then no values for level 3 and level 4. But effectively, the reason I had to do this was so that I could create this path command. Basically go from individual, from having it encoded in a string into having a separate column. Now, in this particular example, I chose to create these levels just so that it's easier for you guys to understand the flow of logic. When you work with your with your specific examples, you don't have to materialize all of these columns and individual IDs. I will make a point of that a little bit later. The reason I'm doing this right now is so that you can understand how I'm going from a path that has a bunch of pipe separated characters into different columns. Because now you could kind of see how I could create a hierarchy already. I could just stack level 1 on top of level 2 ID, level 3 ID, level 4, and I would get the drop down slicer, hierarchical slicer, where I'll be able to drill from 1 to 2 to 5 to 6, for example, right? Unfortunately, these IDs are not very informative. What we want to do is build hierarchy not based on IDs, but based on names. So what we're going to do next is create another 4 columns, and those 4 columns will be used for the real hierarchy, where we use the names of employees instead of using the IDs. Okay, now the real fun begins. So what we want to do is we want to create 4 columns for 4 levels in our hierarchy, and in that column we now want to populate it with what we want to display in the hierarchy slicer. I want to do a simple one first and then make it a little bit complicated later. So right now let's just look at the very simple piece. What we really want to do is we would like to replace 1 with the name of the person. So the logic for this is we're going to use a calculate command, and the reason we want to use a calculate command is because the way these things are calculated when you create a new column, it does 1 record at a time, and as it does that record, it only sees 1 record at a time. But because I may be in row 5 and I need to look up the name of person with ID number 1, then I need to be able to see the whole table, and that's why we do is say filter all employee. So take a look at the entire table, and then take a look at the record, find the record where employee ID is equal to the ID in the column. So when we use the command earlier, or function earlier, that just basically tells us current record, use current record. So use current record and its level 1 ID, so 1, look it up and find the name. So it's going to look up at the whole thing and see, okay, 1 is John, and it's going to populate John here. So I hope the prior calculation made sense, because now we're making it a little bit more complicated. What I want to do is I would like to, in the hierarchy, display the John's name and also his title. So the way I've done it is I've created 2 variables, one for the manager name and one for the title. And what I'm doing is I'm looking both of those things up, and then I'm going to concatenate manager name and title with parentheses to get the field laid out like this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat it for all 4 levels. Again, I'm not going to record it in the interest of saving some time, so I'm just going to create them and we'll go back when they're all done. Okay, now we have all 4 levels calculated. You could see all of these values are now populated. And let me just take a look at this calculation for you guys again, so you understand the logic behind it. The most important thing to understand here is that you could see that the levels are different for the managers. So for example, John, when it's a top level, we see John parentheses CEO. And then everywhere below John is just John for John. And I will explain why that's done, but that gives us some flexibility dealing with situations where transactions are booked not only at the child nodes that have no children, but also at parent nodes. So sometimes you will have hierarchy. For example, you could have it usually in finance and account hierarchy, where all of the transactions are booked only at the base level accounts or accounts that have no children. And those things are pretty easy to work with, and some of the things that we're doing here you don't have to do. But I wanted to do like an all kind of a video that covers a lot of different variations. So in this case, you can book transactions not only at the lowest level, like the lowest level, so we call those leaf level. So leaf means that it has no child nodes. Or actually parent level. So John could be traveling and incurring expenses, Tom could be traveling and incurring expenses, and also Tom's employees could be traveling and incurring expenses. So when I look at Tom, I could take a look at the entire Tom's department, which is HR, or maybe I want to look just at Tom individually. So having Tom VP HR different from Tom allows me to have that flexibility of looking things for the whole department or just him by himself. So again, this whole thing is broken into 2 variables, manager name, and we're just using this function to look up. And we're looking for employee name, where his employee is equal to the level 4 ID. And let's not forget, level 4 in this case would be his own ID. So here we looked up manager name, we looked up the title, so we know those 2 pieces to create the proper name. So for example, here would be Linda HR analyst. And the one thing we're doing is, this is where this hasDirectReports becomes handy. So we're saying if it has direct reports, then this employee has direct reports basically allows us to deal with how we want to show the leaf nodes. I'm going to skip this for now. I want to show you what this thing looks like in Power BI and then come back to it so that this calculation makes a little more sense. Again, I'm doing a little bit of crazy things here just to deal with the scenario where you could book transactions against parent and child. In a situation where you only book transaction against the child nodes, you could just do what we did in level 1 and just repeat the same logic for all 4 columns and be done with it. Okay, now let's see if we can create a hierarchy for our data. So what we could do is we could use a normal Power BI slicer, which is this guy here, drag him over and see if we can be doing something useful with it. So I'm gonna pull in level 1. Oops, wrong level 1, level 2, level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. and you could see how that creates our hierarchy. So on the surface, it looks like we're in good shape. Here's our John, who's the CEO. He has 3 direct reports: VP of IT, HR, and sales. And I could drill into, let's say, HR, Tom, and he's got Kathy, who reports into him. And then he's got all the other employees. And it probably would be okay for some scenarios. It has one issue that could be confusing to the user, and that is because we have this John, because we repeat that name for every column, for every row. So for every column in our level, we have this John repeated 3 times. So what we want to do is we want to use some sort of control that allows us to skip these 3 repeats and just show John once. So it turns out Microsoft does not have a control that natively works with parent-child hierarchies. There's nothing I can do here. I mean, I'm able now to create that parent-child, but you know, I still have to repeat it 3 times, 4 times. And then if you have a hierarchy that's 10 level deeps, 12 levels deep, that would be confusing for people having kind of the same value repeated. So the way we fix it is by using a different slicer. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on 3 dots, get more visuals, and I'm going to look for a what's called hierarchy slicer. So all you need to do is type in hierarchy slicer in the find box, click on this hierarchy slicer and click add. So here I turned our slicer into hierarchy slicer, and you could see I have now John, and it's still kind of doing the same thing, plus it's giving me this annoying pop-up. So let's fix this. The first thing that you want to do is go into the format and turn off that tooltip, because I think it's a little bit annoying. Now when I mouse over, I don't get that thing repeated, flying into our face, the tooltip. And the next thing we want to do is want to figure out how to collapse these 3 levels into one. So the way we could do this is by going into the selection part of the format, and then here we have an option that says hide members. So there's several options to hide members. By default, it's never. In our case, we have populated the value for every level in the hierarchy, therefore empty will not work. Alternative, what we could have done was use empty instead of repeating the same value for every level, but we did repeat, so we're going to say parent. And now you see, instead of repeating John 3 times, it only does it once. So if I go to Tom, we have Tom by himself and Tom in his direct reports, and we have Kathy, and she's only in here once. So by us using this hide member parent name, we're now able to have a more intuitive way to navigate that hierarchy. So I've done a little bit more work on formatting the slicer to match the theme of the report. And now we could do a little bit of testing. So if I have everything selected, I'm looking at travel expenses for the entire company. I can uncheck Tom, John, just look into HR. This is my travel expenses for HR. Or instead of taking a look at everything in HR, I could just take a look at Tom's, the VP specific travel expenses. I could do the same for John as a CEO and take a look at his expenses, or I could take a look at the entire chain of command for John by clicking here. And that's why I've implemented our levels in such a way where I could tell apart John being an individual from John being a head of department. So every time I look at the manager and I see just the name of the manager without a title, then we could have a notation that that means it's an individual, not a department. So now I'm able to traverse the hierarchy and pick individual employees, departments, heads of departments, or the entire company. To summarize, parent-child hierarchies are not native to Power BI and require a little work. The first step we want to make sure is that the top node in the hierarchy does not have a parent ID populated, has to be blank or null. Without that, Power BI will be not happy. and none of the Power BI path functions would work. So once that condition is satisfied, the first thing you do is you use path, and path just creates for every record creates a path of path of command all the way to the top node. Then you don't have to do level 1 through 4. You could have done it on the fly. In this case, I did it just so it's easier to understand. For each column, you populate the ID of the record at that level. So 1, 2, 5, 6 for Linda. That means we have 4 columns for each level, 1, 2, 5, 6. And I could have created hierarchy based off of that by stacking level 1 ID on top of level 2 ID on top of level 3 ID on top of level 4 ID. However, IDs are not very descriptive. So instead of using the IDs that come out of the path, we're using a more descriptive levels, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the way those levels are done is we create, the way I do it is I calculate manager ID and a title. So that gives me the name, or I guess I should just say employee name here. In the title, which would make it a little bit more descriptive. So here you go, and that populates that column. So I do it 4 times, and now I populate giving the ID. So I know that in level 2 it's 2. So I could then find Tom and use Tom's. Well, I guess it is manager, right? So for Linda, Tom is her manager, so I kind of screwed up. Let me fix that. Okay, here you go, all fixed. So for every record, so for Linda here, I look up for level 2, who is the manager ID for level 2? Level 2, number 2 is Tom. So here I'm going to say Tom and his title, VP of HR. So I look up her manager and his title, and then that's what I'm going to put in this column, and I do this for every level. And then by the time I get to level 4, I just have the actual employee and the employee's title if it's has no direct employees, and just the name if it does have direct employees. And once I have those levels populated, I'm able to use the hierarchy slicer in Power BI. So I have to go and get hierarchy slicer from Get More Visuals, and then I'm using the selection hide members feature to make sure that things are not repeated several times for every level. That becomes a real lifesaver if you have hierarchies more than 5, 7 levels deep, because that just makes it more intuitive for people to work with the slicer. Okay, this video took a little bit longer than I expected. There was a little bit of math, and I was trying to be detailed in explaining how these things work. Hope you found this informative, and please come back again soon for more videos. Thanks, bye.